Kita bertemu lagi pada sesi hari ke-9 ya. Jadi 1 hari sebelum acara penutupan ataupun sesi terakhir yang akan kita agendakan di hari Kamis tanggal 28 Juli yang akan datang. 2 hari lagi. Pada kesempatan pagi hari ini kita akan punya 3 pembicara yang sedianya tadinya 4 pembicara ya kalau di agenda rundown yang terdahulu, tetapi dikarenakan ada agenda yang mungkin tidak bisa digeser oleh salah satu pembicara, sehingga untuk agenda pada pagi hari ini kita punya 3 pembicara. Pembicara yang pertama nanti akan ada Profesor Amanda Johnson. Beliau adalah Head of School sekaligus Dekan dari School of Nursing and Midwifery dari University of Newcastle, Australia. Kemudian pembicara yang kedua sudah hadir bersama kita di sini ada Profesor Lisa McKenna, Dean atau Dekan dari School of Nursing and Midwifery Latrobe University, dan juga sudah hadir pula dengan kita pembicara ketiga Bapak Dr. Wantonoro, spesialis keperawatan medikal bedah selaku Wakil Dekan bidang kemahasiswaan dan juga kerjasama Universitas AIDRAN Yogyakarta. Pada pagi hari ini saya rasa ini akan jadi sesi yang sangat menarik, khususnya untuk teman-teman yang akan berprofesi sebagai pengajar ataupun teman-teman yang sudah berprofesi sebagai pengajar di institusi pendidikan kesehatan, karena kita akan belajar secara langsung tentang kurikulum yang inklusif bagi penyandang disabilitas. Bapak Ibu semua, saya ingatkan bahwa pada saat dua sesi yang pertama, yaitu sesi dengan Profesor Amanda dan juga sesi dengan Profesor Lisa, Anda bisa menggunakan interpretation app ataupun translasi dari bahasa Inggris ke bahasa Indonesia, yang mana nanti untuk interpretasinya ataupun translasinya, penerjemahan dari bahasa Inggris ke bahasa Indonesia akan berlangsung secara simultan. Jadi Anda hanya tinggal perlu mengklik gambar ataupun fitur bola dunia di bagian bawah aplikasi Zoom yang Anda gunakan, baik itu di HP maupun di layar laptop Anda. Selain itu, untuk teman-teman penyandang disabilitas rungu juga ada fasilitas juru bahasa isyarat yang saat ini difasilitasi oleh Mbak Yanda, dan juga ada closed caption untuk teman-teman penyandang disabilitas rungu yang juga ingin berkontribusi dan mendengarkan dan mengikuti secara langsung diskusi ini. Baik, kita masih menunggu pembicara yang pertama untuk bergabung bersama kita. Mudah-mudahan pada sesi kali ini, karena kita juga sedang mendekati tahun ajaran baru, dapat berkontribusi terhadap penyusunan kurikulum, khususnya penyusunan kurikulum kebidanan, keperawatan, dan juga prodi kesehatan lainnya yang lebih inklusif ya terhadap penyandang disabilitas, khususnya pada setting pendidikan dan juga klinis.
Oke, kita tunggu sebentar ya sampai jam 10.30 atau 8.30 waktu Indonesia ini. Sorry ya. Terima kasih.
Yeah.
Profesor.
Okay.
Profesor Amanda sudah di sini.
Yes. Halo Amanda.
Halo Amanda.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, yes.
Great.
Good morning, Amanda. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah.
Langsung kita mulai ya, Bu Dina.
Yeah. Can we check first the audio? Pak Hikmat, is it all right?
Amanda, my name is Cesa and I will be the chair for today's session. I'm from UNISA and we have simultaneous translator for today's session.
Yes.
So for the participant or audience with in Bahasa Indonesia, they can access the interpretation button. So yeah, you will have 20 minutes for presentation, and then after that, followed up by 10 minutes question and answer for your session. So,
great.
Yeah.
All right. I'm just going to close my office door. Just hold on a moment.
Right, then.
I've just come from chairing another meeting, so I just need to have a glass of water before I present talking.
And also, Amanda, do you need me to share your screen? I can do that for you.
Yes, if you could share my slides, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much.
Oke, baik, kita mulai Bapak dan Ibu semua. Selamat pagi. Pada pagi hari ini kita akan memulai sesi yang ke-9, hari ke-9, dan ketiga pembicara kita semuanya sudah hadir. Nama saya Cesa, saya dosen dari Prodi Kebidanan Universitas Aisyah Yogyakarta. Saat ini saya mengenakan hijab atau jilbab berwarna ungu, kemudian mengenakan kacamata dan juga bros bunga berwarna serupa. Pada kesempatan pagi hari ini, saya akan memperkenalkan pembicara kita yang pertama, yaitu Profesor Amanda Johnson. Beliau adalah Head of School dan juga Dekan dari School of Nursing and Midwifery, University of Newcastle, Australia. Beliau juga merupakan koeditor dari buku teks Chronic Illness dan Disabilitas, dan beliau memang sangat concern serta dimulai dari tesis disertasi beliau mengenai nursing the dying ataupun bagaimana merawat orang yang mungkin
Bu Cesa, sorry sebentar. Bu Cesa, maaf.
Ya.
Kayaknya Pak Hikmat belum masuk nih.
Oh, oke.
Bentar ya. Oke. Alright, okay. He's here. Okay. Alright, okay, cool. So hang on, Amanda, can you now hear the English translation interpreter?
Yes, I'm hearing it in Indonesian. Is that right? Is that what
you can also hear the English interpretation when I speak in Bahasa Indonesia.
Oke.
Bu Amanda juga bisa mendengarkan translasi berbahasa Inggris ketika saya berbicara dengan menggunakan bahasa Indonesia.
Can you hear it, Amanda, in English?
No. But
Amanda,
yeah.
If you look at the reaction next to the reaction tab,
there's the interpretation button.
Yes, and then you click English.
Yes, and I had clicked English. Yes.
Okay. All right. Bu Cesa, can you start now talking in Bahasa Indonesia? Ya.
Baik, jadi memang ekspertis dari Profesor Amanda ini terkait dengan bagaimana merawat disabilitas, khususnya pada mereka yang kalau di tesisnya terkait dengan nursing the dying gitu. Nah, tanpa menunggu waktu yang lebih lama lagi, kita akan mendengarkan dan menyimak presentasi Profesor Amanda. Profesor Amanda, over to you.
Thank you. Could my slides, thank you. So just a little bit of background for those of you. I started at the University of Newcastle in March 2020, and I'd like to thank you for having me here today to present on promoting inclusive educational curricula to promote accessible healthcare in nursing, midwifery and public health curricula. Next slide, please. Inclusive educational curricula. I see it as a wonderful opportunity because education is a right for all people. And importantly, it shows that how we design curricula signals as to who will participate and who succeeds. And by that design, we actually demonstrate to other people the values proposition that underpins our institution that offers the program of study. So it is around meeting a human need, and it is around higher education providers or universities saying to their community, to their society, that they welcome all people, regardless of their background, personal experiences, to be involved in a program of study. Thank you. Next slide. Inclusive curricula defined is around looking at the learning needs of all students, and by acknowledging their characteristics derived from previous experiences and the diversity of personal experiences that our students come with. And by that I mean there are various elements that need to be considered. The level and type of entry qualifications that someone may come in with, the person's ability, the person's knowledge, their educational experience. Did they go to secondary level of education? Have they had previous life experiences? How do they like to learn? Are they a didactic learner? Are they an experiential learner? In terms of their own self or their own disposition, what is their self-esteem like? Do they have confidence and motivation to learn? Do they have aspiration to succeed? What are their expectations of coming into a Bachelor of Nursing program? What attitudes do they come? What attitudes do they have that may have been preconceived before they come into a Bachelor of Nursing program? What maturity do they have as a learner? What's their level of emotional intelligence? What is their self-awareness about them and how they're going to interact with other human beings? What gender are they? Does their gender influence the way they perceive learning? What about their sexuality and its orientation? How does that impact on their capacity to be involved in a program of study? There are circumstantial diversity dimensions that we need to look at as well. Age, disability, whether or not they've engaged in paid or voluntary employment. Do they have caring responsibilities, young children, older parents? Are they geographically located to the program of study, or do they have to travel many miles to be able to access the learning? Do they have appropriate IT interventions in place? Do they have appropriate transport to get them from the university and back to their home residence? Do they have the financial acumen to support them while they're engaged in their studies? And do they have the support of their family unit to be able to undertake studies? Is language an issue? What values do they bring to the program of study? What is their culture? How does their religion and beliefs influence how they're going to engage in the Bachelor of Nursing program? What is it about their ethnicity that might influence their perceptions around the things that they're going to learn? All of these are aspects that an inclusive curriculum have to consider. So it is quite extensive, it has breadth, and it must also have depth. So now I'm just going to take you on a bit of a journey about how I came to sort of look at inclusive curriculum in my own work. Next slide, please. In higher education, we have a number of competing tensions. We do need to comply with disability legislation, and in Australia, that is known as the Disability Discrimination Act, where everybody, regardless of their ability, must have access to educational opportunities. This is governed by what they call the Standards for Disability Education, and those standards were reviewed in 2020 and basically endorse that all people within the community need to have access to educational offerings. And that is certainly the global perspective as well. We also see within our government policy that we want to widen participation. So we want people who are first in family. We want people who are first in family. We want people who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. We want to encourage people who are disabled to engage in programs of study. So when they talk about widening participation, what they're referring to is increasing the diversity of the student cohort so that we have many different people coming from different pathways to undertake a program of study. There is a whole body of literature around inclusive education practice, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment in more detail, but it's around that notion of putting into place that when you design a curriculum, you actually have inclusive practices for the design of the curriculum and its implementation, that being teaching, so that you engage the learner, you engage all learners, and you move your activities of teaching and learning activities in such a way that they enable people to succeed within the program of study that they're undertaking. We also need to look at institutional risk management when we're talking about higher education, because we need to consider what are the attrition and retention rates for students that come from equity groups, such as those who are disabled, and what is it about when we do take students who are first in family, who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, or who are disabled, what is it that the institution needs to put in place in order to support these students to succeed? Because we don't want to support, put in place a program of study, invite them to come into the program, and then have nothing that supports them to enable them to be successful. Next slide, please. So when we're designing inclusive curriculum, we really need to pay attention to this notion or this concept of universal instructional design. And it was originally developed by an architect in the built environment, and it was Zeff in 2007 who developed these principles, if you like. Kerr and Baker then adapted them so that they can apply to any curricula for any discipline. And it allows us to design a program of study that allows access for all students to the teaching and learning. And there are 6 key principles that are involved within this universal instructional design. And I'm just going to take you through them, and I'm going to illustrate one of them in particular as an example of some work that I've done. So the first principle is that all inherent requirements need to be clearly articulated and made available to students prior to enrolment. So when we talk, if you could go to the next slide, when we talk about inherent requirements, just waiting for the next slide to come up. So when we talk about inherent requirements, we're actually talking about what is inherent within the program of study. That is the Bachelor of Nursing program. So we set up a project that looked to determine what those inherent requirements were for a Bachelor of Nursing program, and it was known as the Inherent Requirement of Nurse Education Project, or the IRON project. And it's work that I did at the University of Western Sydney, now known as Western Sydney University, and the work was for the Bachelor of Nursing was finalised in 2010. Next slide. So inherent requirements are fundamental components of a course or a unit that are essential to demonstrate the capabilities, knowledge, and skills to achieve core learning outcomes while preserving the academic integrity of the university's learning, assessment, and accreditation processes. And we originally set this work up for students who were disabled. We wanted to put in place something that would clearly explain to students who were disabled what the expectations of the program, the Bachelor of Nursing program, was before they enrolled, so that they were very clear. But what we found with this work was that it translated to all students. It wasn't just for students who were disabled. And this work has been adopted by many Australian and New Zealand universities since it was first published in 2010. If we could go to the next slide, please. So inherent requirements in their broader understanding is a student enabling support strategy that supports the student to succeed and for us to retain the student and to therefore be a graduate at the end of the Bachelor of Nursing program. And that's really what all higher education providers want to achieve. It's a tool that facilitates communication between a student, the disability advisor, and the academic, and it applies to all and is based on ability, not disability. And it promotes transparent and consistent decision-making. So you'll recall that originally I said we started this work with those students who were disabled, but we've come to use the inherent requirements statements for all students, not just those who are disabled. If we could go to the next slide. When we developed the piece of work, there were 8 domains identified for the Bachelor of Nursing program. If you could bring them all up, that's fine. So in constructing our inherent requirement statements, these were the areas that we believed captured many of the inherency of a Bachelor of Nursing program. And we know that this is workable because many of my colleagues in other universities adopted the Bachelor of Nursing inherent requirement statements that I developed at the University of Western Sydney. And we did a number of benchmarking activities with other universities to see if there was resonance with what we were producing, and there certainly has been. If you could move to the next slide. So the inherent requirements framework it consists of these elements, 5 elements: an introductory statement, a description of the requirement, a justification for why it's inherent, the level, and then it provides examples of what that might look like from an academic perspective or from a clinical perspective where necessary. So it's an educative tool for academics as much as it is a tool for decision-making for students who are disabled and anybody that might be providing program management. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to provide you with an example of what a Bachelor of Nursing inherent requirement statement looks like. So this one is about communication, and it's about verbal communication. And clearly, as a registered nurse, verbal communication is very important in the everyday business of providing nursing care. And so this allows people prior to enrolment. So when they're making the decision to come into the program, these inherent requirement statements are published on the website of the university. And when I worked at Western Sydney University, we would encourage people as part of their enrolment process to look at the inherent requirement statements and confirm for us that they had read them, understood them, and that if they needed to make a referral to the Disability Services Unit, that they would do so upon commencement. And that's about supporting people. As you recall, this is a tool that can be used to support students and enable them to succeed. And the earlier we pick up students who need assistance, then it is much better for the student and also for the academics in their courses. I'll just move to the next slide. So principle 2 of universal design principles is that you must regularly evaluate the accessibility and the inclusiveness and modify accordingly any of the teaching strategies and assessment modalities that you put in place. There's no point putting them in if you're not going to actually assess whether or not they're of any use to you. If we go to the next slide, the third principle is that all learning materials and learning technologies used be accessible by students using assistive technologies. So it means that you can't put in place and say, oh, we want the students to use a podcast if students don't have a learning platform that's going to be able to allow them to access that particular learning resource. So that's just an example to illustrate that principle. The fourth principle is that all learning materials be clearly presented in plain English to facilitate optimum communication, or that can be modified that all learning materials be clearly presented in the language of the country in which the program is being developed. And so that's an important thing to consider. And when we talk about clearly presented, it's about using language that is accessible. So we often academics speak in very highfalutin, jargonistic ways of describing elements of a program. But what we really need to do is think about the endpoint user, who is the student, and be as clear as we possibly can about what it is that we expect the student to do within whatever learning material that we're presenting. If we go to principle 5, teaching staff adopt a flexible and inclusive attitude with regard to making alternative arrangements as required due to disability. So again, this is translatable not just for students who are disabled. This is actually translatable for all academics to be able to be responsive to varying needs within their cohort and to understand how that will impact on the students' learning and impact on the assessment that they've set for that particular group. And the last principle that Kerr and Baker describe is that we need to be flexible with timelines, assessment tasks, and course requirements. We need to actually be proactive and look at the student load, for instance, across the course. So if it's a semester-long program and it's 13 weeks and there are 4 courses that the student is involved in, you wouldn't want to give them 5 pieces of assessment in every course, because that equals 20 assessment items. That is an incredible load for a student. It's also an incredible load for the academic. So this principle is around looking at very pragmatic elements of course design and requires us to map a schedule of our assessments so that we get that in vertical and horizontal integration of the curriculum. If we go to the next slide. So these are just some references that relate to some of the work that I've done. But I'd also like to share with you that whilst we undertook the inherent requirement, while we produced, the inherent requirement students for statements for the Bachelor of Nursing, what we also did was to develop those and use the Bachelor of Nursing statements as a prototype, and we translated them to something like 69 programs of study across various disciplines in Western Sydney University. So we did medicine, we did podiatry, we did physiotherapy, but we also did engineering, we also did languages, we also did engineering, we also did public health. And so it's important to understand that that particular tool that we developed became a support and enabling tool that really facilitated all students engaging with various programs of study, not just those that were nursing. It's important for us to be able to put in place an inclusive curriculum design, because it will allow us then to be able to produce a graduate who understands difference, who values diversity, who is able to care with people with a very principled approach to the way that they deliver care, because they've been exposed to that through modelling of the academics in their program, and by the learning and teaching activities that are put in place, you are also modelling those aspects as well. So the curriculum cannot be seen as separate to the human elements that we need to build within our graduate as a nurse, as a midwife, or as a public health practitioner. So it is important that we consider that right from the outset, when designing a curriculum, that we use the universal design principles, and that we understand what tools are available to assist us to acknowledge that there is diversity in the student group that comes to undertake our program, and that we should celebrate that as something that is special, and we should celebrate that getting those students to be to the end of their program of study is actually a significant success. And by enabling students who have a different sexual orientation, who have a different belief system, who are disabled, or who learn in a different way, those graduates then go to care for people who also have those differences as well. And so we are preparing a workforce that is reflective of the wider society that those nurses, public health practitioners and midwives are serving, and that is really important. And just in conclusion, I'd like to say that at the Commonwealth Government here in Australia, we are looking to provide a framework that assists universities to look at a framework for supporting people who are intellectually disabled to have content within curriculum, so that we can meet the intellectual needs of people much better than what we have been doing. And that I'm currently working as the Council of Deans of Nursing and Midwifery representative on that group. And I think that, again, that will only enhance our curriculum design, not just across health professions, but across all disciplines, to be able to better meet that need. And what it means is that we should have non-stereotypical case studies being provided within curriculums, so that people can see a true, realistic reflection of the people that they're going to be caring for in the wider community. And we do know that there is a high level of intellectual disability from very profound to minimal that is not addressed in many curriculum in Australia, and I would attest in probably other countries as well. And the other thing to say is that when we're developing curriculum, we need to make sure that when we talk about inclusivity and we're designing learning materials, we must also ensure that we go across the lifespan, that we use non-stereotypical examples for our case studies or for scenarios that students might be exposed to, so that the students are not given a message within the curriculum that skews them to a particular perspective. So it's really important that, just like I talked about the assessment load being mapped, you should also map the types of learning materials that you're developing, the age of those people, the cultural background of the people that you've selected for your case studies. Every element of your curriculum, from the learning outcomes right through to the end product, needs to be mapped in terms of its inclusivity and whether or not the principles of universal design are encaptured. And I hope that's been of some interest and value to you. Thank you. I think there's another slide if you want to go to that.
Oke, terima kasih banyak Ibu Amanda, Profesor Amanda atas paparannya. Jadi Profesor Amanda menekankan sebenarnya tidak hanya mahasiswa kesehatan saja yang perlu memahami tentang ataupun belajar ya mengenai memberikan mengakomodasi dan memenuhi kebutuhan bagi teman-teman penyandang disabilitas. Tetapi dengan adanya inherent requirement ya tadi disebutnya dan menerapkan universal design pada kurikulum dan ditetapkan di semua program studi di semua fakultas itu justru akan memberikan poin plus dalam hal tadi bahwa ini jadi tanggung jawab kita bersama karena memenuhi hak dan kebutuhan teman-teman penyandang disabilitas itu juga merupakan kewajiban dari seluruh lapisan masyarakat. Baik, kita masuk ke dalam sesi tanya jawab dan kita sudah punya beberapa pertanyaan di sini. Profesor Amanda bisa langsung, Profesor Amanda can you hear Pak Hikmat ya?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
The interpreter.
Yep, I can hear the English translation coming through.
Baik, saya akan membacakan pertanyaan yang pertama dari Ibu Tresia. Ibu Tresia bertanya mengenai batasan disabilitas yang diterima sebagai mahasiswa, khususnya di University of Newcastle, seperti apa? Dan juga khususnya juga misalnya bagaimana teknis saat mereka melakukan magang mungkin atau praktek kerja, atau kalau ada mahasiswa kesehatan yang juga memiliki disabilitas bekerja di praktik di klinik lapangan, apakah diterima di setiap tempat praktik?
Okay, so to answer the first question, we're actually governed by the Disability Discrimination Act 1992 that was amended in 2009. It has a very extensive range of physical, psychological, and well-being conditions and impairments and side effects of medications which are considered to be a disability in a very broad sense. The other thing we need to understand is that caring responsibilities also come under the Disability Discrimination Act as well. So the university, any university in Australia, is legislated to comply with that legislation. So we can't put any limits. So we can't say because you're short-statured or because you have an amputated leg or because you are bipolar, I'm just giving some examples, or because you are the carer of 2 young children, that you should be prohibited and not enrolled into a Bachelor of Nursing program or any other program in a university. In response to the second question, what we need to do when a student who, for instance, might be short-statured and has to engage with clinical practice, then reasonable adjustments, which is where under the legislation, we make accommodations for students to be able to engage in clinical practice. Now, and that is possible to do those sorts of things. Students who have a mental illness and who are medicated and stable may never have to have any accommodations. We know that university is one of the biggest stresses that a person may experience, and sometimes a mental illness has been undiagnosed or is triggered as a result of coming into university. And so they may require a period of time of medication, and we make accommodations for that. For the person that has young children and is a single parent and has caring responsibilities, we would look to put their placements within a reasonable geographical location using their postcode and trying to facilitate that and to give them as much notice as possible to be able to put in place networks to support the care of their children whilst they're on a morning or an evening shift. And it might be that initially we have to put them on a evening shift because that's the only support network that they have. But as they progress through their program, they may be able to establish other networks, and we also need to be able to offer morning shifts because they need to have experienced that. So that's why publishing the inherent requirement statements and having students, potential students, look at them prior to enrolling is really important, so they understand that they need to have various things in place to be able to do their program. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that they need to do clinical placement, and that we're very clear that clinical placement can be in a large geographical area. So we do need to explicate that, and some universities do that better than others, and that can be somewhat of a challenge from time to time. But if you have it documented through the inherent requirements framework, then it allows you to have that conversation with the individual.
Terima kasih, Amanda. Sangat jelas ya bahwa memang harus ada akomodasi yang layak yang harus disediakan oleh perguruan tinggi, dan kalau di Australia memang sudah ada law ataupun hukum, payung hukumnya. Di Indonesia sebenarnya juga sudah ada, tetapi mudah-mudahan akan lebih banyak yang pihak kampus juga yang lebih menyadari bahwa ini merupakan hak asasi bagi seluruh warga negara. Karena ini juga nyambung dengan pertanyaan dari Bu Dina berikutnya, yaitu Amanda, bagaimana memberikan pemahaman yang sama kepada seluruh fakultas untuk punya komitmen pengembangan kurikulum yang inklusif, terutama di fakultas-fakultas teknik misalnya, dengan konteks di Indonesia yang masih kuat menyandang disabilitas hanya bisa belajar ilmu-ilmu tertentu. Adakah advice yang bisa disampaikan oleh Amanda? Terima kasih.
Yes, and so important that in order to have a skilled workforce, we must ensure we have a responsibility as higher education providers to ensure that all people can access all programs. And so there is, for example, I'll give you a good example where a doctor who was a quadriplegic, he finished his Bachelor of Medicine. He had to have accommodation clearly, but he didn't seek work where he was a physician or a surgeon. He went into medical research. And that means that that individual is making a valuable personal, financial and social contribution to the Australian society, that if we hadn't have put those accommodations in place, that person's self-esteem, their productivity and who they are as a person would have been would not have been appropriately supported by our community. And people do have the right to access education at any level, whether they're disabled or not. Remember, my focus, originally I said to you, we started our work and it was for people who were disabled, but we translated that work and we now speak about the work as supporting all students, because inherent requirements are important for every student to be made aware of, because they might have a learning style that's not compatible with the program that they're going into or the way the curriculum is set up, or they might have a cultural belief, which means that they don't want to do a Bachelor of Nursing at University X, but they might want to do it at another university because it aligns with their values and beliefs.
Baik, terima kasih Amanda. Saya jadi ini sedikit banyak juga sama dengan yang disampaikan oleh pembicara dari Latrop yang waktu itu dari Faculty of Law ya Bu Dina ya, bahwa perlu ada semacam pilot project dan nantinya dipublikasikan, ada publisitas di mana seorang penyandang disabilitas juga bisa berkontribusi bagi masyarakat, dan itu karena peran dari kampusnya, dari pimpinan perguruan tingginya. Jadi ini juga pertanyaan dari Bu Fitri tadi juga sudah terjawab sepertinya, karena pertanyaannya serupa dengan pertanyaan Bu Dina, karena Bu Fitri juga merupakan penyandang disabilitas netra, di mana harapan beliau pendidikan tentang disabilitas itu menjadi mata kuliah umum di semua universitas, bukan hanya di Fakultas Kesehatan atau sejenisnya. Mungkin ada lagi yang ingin ditanyakan atau dikonfirmasi dari teman-teman semua? Apabila teman-teman peserta ingin bertanya secara langsung juga bisa menggunakan fitur raise hand, angkat tangan dan bertanya kepada Ibu Amanda. Baik, sepertinya sudah cukup. Yang satu hal yang ingin saya garis bawahi di sesi dari Profesor Amanda, bahwa inherent requirement ini sejatinya memang mestinya diterapkan di semua universitas dan diberlakukan pada seluruh mahasiswa, bukan hanya mahasiswa kesehatan, karena sebenarnya tanggung jawab perguruan tinggi, tanggung jawab institusi pendidikan adalah untuk memastikan bahwa lulusannya itu memahami perbedaan, kemudian menghargai diversity, menghargai keberagaman, dan ini sebenarnya tidak boleh dipisahkan dengan kurikulum itu, bukan tidak terpisah, tapi dia hanya sebagai tool yang nantinya bisa membuat seluruh mahasiswa bisa berinteraksi dan ikut berkontribusi terhadap memberikan akomodasi yang layak bagi teman-teman penyandang disabilitas. Baik, terima kasih Profesor Amanda. Demikian untuk sesi yang pertama. Kita beri aplaus kepada Profesor Amanda.
Thank you. I just wanted to make one other comment too. In Australia, we're fortunate that our higher education governance that looks at quality assurance for programs has one of its standards around student support, and they are very much embrace inherent requirements as one of those elements. Within the discipline of nursing, the Australian and Nurses Midwifery Council also has a standard that speaks to student support, and they highly recommend to universities offering a Bachelor of Nursing program that the inherent requirement statements are used. So I think it's also important to have those regulatory bodies support your initiative to put in place inclusive curriculum design and have the overarching legislation sitting behind you so that you can impart a tool that will support students for success. And thank you very much for having me.
Terima kasih Amanda, luar biasa ya. Ini karena kita jadi punya gambaran bahwa kalau kemarin, iya, thank you so much Amanda. Karena kita jadi punya gambaran bahwa rekomendasinya mungkin kalau kemarin teman-teman peserta ada yang merekomendasikan kepada BPJS, kepada Komite Akreditasi Rumah Sakit. Sekarang jangan-jangan mungkin nanti akan ada ide untuk memberikan rekomendasi kepada Badan Akreditasi Nasional atau Lampetekes begitu ya, Lembaga Akreditasi Mandiri Perguruan Tinggi Kesehatan atau Badan Akreditasi Nasional, khususnya dalam hal memberikan dukungan kepada mahasiswa untuk bisa memberikan akomodasi yang layak. Baik, kita akan menuju ke pembicara yang kedua, yaitu Profesor Lisa McKenna. Halo Lisa.
Selamat pagi Cesa.
Selamat pagi. Selamat pagi waktu Edinburgh Lisa. Jadi sebelum Lisa memulai, saya akan membacakan terlebih dahulu CV singkat beliau. Profesor Lisa McKenna merupakan dekan dari School of Nursing and Midwifery, Latrobe University, Australia. Beliau juga merupakan editor-in-chief di Australian Journal of Nursing Practice, Scholarship and Research, editorial dan advisor untuk Nurse Education Today, dan juga baru-baru ini ya mendapatkan banyak penghargaan terkait dengan riset dan kontribusi beliau, termasuk saat ini kehadiran beliau di Edinburgh juga untuk menerima penghargaan. Pada kesempatan kali ini, Profesor Lisa McKenna akan menyampaikan terkait dengan bagaimana kurikulum yang bisa kita terapkan gitu ya, ataupun diimplementasikan di institusi pendidikan khususnya kesehatan. Kepada Ibu Lisa, over to you.
Terima kasih. And I hope my presentation is good this morning. It's 3 a.m. here, so it's I've been asleep and I've woken up to do the presentation, so hopefully all good. I'm really pleased to be following Amanda's presentation, and I was very conscious of what Amanda would be talking about. So I'm looking at this from a different perspective, and so I'm going to look at, how do we make our curriculum itself really inclusive? And so hopefully you find it interesting, and I'm hoping my slides are going to move. And I thought it was probably good in this respect to go back and revisit the Sustainable Development Goals and what we're trying to achieve with those. And we know with the Sustainable Development Goals, we're trying to embed those throughout our curriculum. And I've looked overall, the Sustainable Development Goals are the world's shared plan towards reducing extreme poverty, inequality, and protecting the planet. But we're also looking at some key contributors in there. So we're really focusing, particularly in our nursing and midwifery programs, on achieving good health and well-being, reducing inequalities, and gender equality. And so they're really important things when we're looking at disability and how we enable our students and our graduates to be able to provide care that's appropriate for people with disabilities. And it's certainly one of the things that we've identified is really not as good in our curricula as it could be. And at the moment, at La Trobe, we're actually rewriting our curriculum with a mindset around disability and what that means and how we incorporate it. I'm sorry, there's a bit of background noise here, but hopefully you can hear me okay. So I wanted to start with diversity and inequity broadly, and then I'll focus down on disability. But I think as we're writing curricula, we really need to be mindful of the diverse populations that we work with. As nurses, we work with lots of different people with lots of different characteristics. So they have different cultures, languages, and beliefs. And even in Indonesia, that's very much the case. Here in Australia, no, I say here in Australia, I'm sitting in Scotland. In Australia, we have a lot of health inequities around our Indigenous peoples, and there's a lot of Commonwealth, state, and local government activity around improving the health and well-being of our First Nations people. We also have a lot of immigrants and refugees that bring lots of other different aspects of diversity and inequality with them, gender, religion, sexual orientation, and people living in poverty all have different degrees of health inequity. And obviously, lastly, we're talking particularly about disability here. And I think, in our population, there is still a lot of health inequity for people with disabilities. And I know over the last few weeks, you've been introduced to the NDIS. We've talked about lots of different aspects of a disability in Australia. So we'll focus on some particular aspects. And I was really interested, and I'm not sure if Amanda or Dina are even aware, but last week at the Australian Institute of Health and Wellbeing, sorry, I'm having a bit of the health and welfare, we're having a bit of a background noise here, released a new report on disability in Australia. And it identified that 1 in 6 people in Australia has some sort of disability. And that's pretty profound. And I think that statistic really resonated with me. We have a small population, but that still comes to 4.4 million people. Now, some of those people will experience health inequity and some will be able to manage and not have those inequities. But it is an interesting number. And I think even if you're thinking about Indonesia, and if there's 1 in 6 people have a disability in Indonesia, that's a lot of people. on a population that you have. 1 in 3 of those with disability have severe or profound disability in Australia. Again, that's a lot of people, and I think we don't even acknowledge that very often. For 1 in 4, 20 or 23% of people with a disability, their main form of disability is mental or behavioural. So you can see, even in Australia, that we have quite a problem, not a problem, we have quite a diversity of prevalence of disability. And I think by thinking about it in this way, we have to acknowledge that we need to prepare our nurses and midwives to be able to manage people with disabilities. They're going to encounter them. When we look at these sorts of figures, probably on a daily basis, they will be encountering someone who has some form of disability, whether that's impacting on their capabilities. That may not be the case, but it's quite important for us to think about. So as I think about that a bit more broadly, I was thinking, well, nurses and midwives are going to encounter individuals with disabilities. We need to understand how to provide individualised care that is appropriate for the disability, but also appropriate on that individual's needs. So we have a really important role to play in being able to assess people well and to provide individualised care. And we also have a responsibility to ensure access to care, to ensure that people are safe and in our care, but also to optimise their outcomes. And the healthcare system is maybe not as complicated in Indonesia, but it's still complicated. But, to helping people to navigate the complexities of that health system is very important. And I know even in Australia, that is something that people really struggle with, is finding the care that they need. And so we do have a role to play in helping people navigate that health system. So in that, we need to build into the curriculum things that are going to help our students be able to do that, to understand the system, to be able to help people within that health service and the health system. And I think it's important to come back to one of the premises of nursing and midwifery. We have our curriculum that are really underpinned by person-centred care. We talk about that all the time. And I think in the context of disability, this is really important. It's the way that nurses interact with, and research has shown that the way that nurses interact with each other and with the person cared for and their family, it's really important that that is a structure that's well supported. We know that person-centred care and co-creation of care are associated positively with the well-being and job satisfaction of professionals. So that's also another angle, particularly when we're looking at nurses being burnt out and finding it very hard to manage during COVID, but it can be reassuring and satisfying to work with people if we've got a good system around person-centred care. And you will know that as you're working with people in your care, if you can provide that full person-centred holistic type care, it is very satisfying. But sometimes the systems don't allow us to do that as much as we should be able to. So I'm going to take a step through looking at the role of health professionals more broadly, and then we'll talk a little bit about how do we put this into a curriculum framework. Health professionals play a big role. So not just nurses and midwives and public health professionals, but all health professionals. And we need to ensure that they've got the right education and training. We know they're working with individuals and communities, so we need to actually be able to educate them to be able to do that. To work with organisations and know how organisations function, to be able to work in partnership with people with disabilities, not to work for them, but to work with them, and to work as advocates and to help them, as I say, navigate through the challenges and opportunities that the health system might give us. And this is around in health inequity more broadly, but it covers disabilities as well. So we need to think from lots of different levels. As we develop curriculum, and I think we've touched on the concept of co-design in previous weeks. We've had some amazing presentations over the weeks, but I'm going to touch on the concepts of co-design and co-production in the context of curriculum. And just to talk about the differences, because they're very subtle differences between what we mean by co-design and what we mean by co-production. So co-design brings stakeholders together to design new health services, policies and products. And that's really important if we're looking at services for people with disabilities, that we're working with them and they're helping us to design them. We're not designing for them, we're designing with them and thinking about the needs that they have. Co-production is similar, but it's working with stakeholders such as patients, families and their carers to ensure that the care and the support they receive is the highest quality care. So it's a little different. So one's looking at designing a product or a service, and the other's just looking at the context of care a little bit broadly. And I think these are really important when we're thinking about how we write curriculum that are going to be able to enable nurses and midwives to have the skills they need. Some researchers in the broader health professions have put together a context around co-production of healthcare services. And I think, again, we've talked about this in different sessions, but how we need to involve communities and societies to help develop that healthcare system and what it looks like, patients and professionals, to co-produce high quality value health services that have good health outcomes for all. It's the same with curriculum. And so these concepts go across to our curriculum design. There's another factor here that I want to talk about, and it's a concept that's fairly new, and it's called experience-based co-design. And it's an approach to health service design that engages patients and healthcare staff in partnership to develop and improve health services or pathways of care. It involves participatory action research that involves service users to actually go through processes of improving that care. So it's bringing a research approach into a very strategic way of improving our care and going through cycles to get to optimum levels of care. It is a new concept, but it's really important that we think about how we work with people and we think about the tools that we have to be able to help us work through these. So again, if we're talking about things like action research as a way of promoting co-design, we need to make sure that nurses and midwives have the skills to be able to do that. And so it's even thinking about our research subjects in our curriculum and how do they enable people to get some skills that they can use, not just in a research context, but in a healthcare setting context as well for improvement of healthcare. I'm going to talk a little bit about two projects that we've done that staff in my school have done to talk about co-design so that you can see how it works. These are not in a disability context, but the principles are the same. So in this first study, it was a study of co-designing a program to support those people who were living on the streets, basically, and they were homeless. And the researchers worked with a group of 11 homeless people to identify a strategy to improve their care, to improve their well-being, and to eliminate some of the risks they face living on the streets. They had 12 sessions where they worked with a group of homeless people to work through cycles of how they might do this and develop a communication strategy that they could have ongoing support for these people. And as it turned out, the thing that you would probably not expect was that they ended up developing a website that provided people on the street with the resources that they need about being safe and the facilities that were out there to support them. And they were able to access it. They'd help develop the process. So when you think about if you were planning something for homeless people, you wouldn't necessarily think a website would be that helpful for them. But actually that was what they wanted. So thinking about including people along the way to develop and evaluate services that help them and support them. The guiding principles around this project were all around inclusion, equity, to ensure that everybody's voice was heard and everybody's input was valued, that capacity was built, it was a safe environment, and that people could work towards an outcome that was useful for everybody. And I think having the ability to embed this in our staff and our students is something that we need to think about, having the skills to be able to work with groups. The other study that I want to highlight is, it seems a lot of words here, but it was a program around co-designing support strategies for midwives and caring for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who had complex traumas. And this is a study that's still ongoing. But again, it's using that action research approach to work with that community to develop frameworks and support services that will actually meet their needs and that are usable and sustainable. And really to enable those people to have the best outcomes beyond their trauma. I'm having a bit of trouble seeing my screen at the moment. So the goals of the research really were to identify the relevant services and key stakeholders, to build a community of practice, to develop protocols to support safe care, and to develop a strategy that the recognition and access to complex trauma for these women was actually really optimised, that we could develop safe, acceptable and feasible perinatal strategies for increasing awareness among providers of healthcare for these women, and to build the capacity within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women themselves to actually support their own communities. So again, it's quite empowering when we use these approaches. So what are some of the challenges then, if we're looking at building programs that can enable people to grow and develop and to have the services that suit them and enable their healthcare to be optimised? Healthcare professional education has a few challenges in this regard, and some of them I've talked about already. We don't have national guidelines to look at population variations such as disability. In Australia, our Nursing and Midwifery Accreditation Council has guidelines around inclusion of content for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations, but that's all of that that's prescribed, so that there's nothing to say we have to have disability content. There's nothing to say we have to have anything around health inequity. So this is something that's a challenge for us. So our curriculum at the moment might not adequately prepare our graduates for caring for all sorts of population minorities, even those with disabilities. And so that in itself has the potential to further contribute to health inequities and poorer outcomes. If we're not educating nurses, midwives and health professionals to deal with people with disabilities, then that has the potential for them to have worse outcomes. And I think that we really need to get really serious about how we embed this in our curricula. So going back to co-design and co-production, I've talked a little bit about those, but they may be a step to help us to start to address these issues. And I know I'm probably getting over time, but recently some medical and health professional authors have developed a framework for developing health curricula using the concepts of co-design and co-production. And there's a lot of words here, and I'm not going to talk about it in a lot of detail, but their work is really helpful for us. And they've developed this in the context of COLD stakeholders. So people potentially with language from non-English speaking backgrounds. So, but the principles go across very, very well. So if people are interested, I think it's worth having a look at their approach. They use a phased development to achieve co-production in the development of curriculum. And in short, the first phase is really identifying the local population subgroups. So in this case, we'd be looking at people with disability, understanding the disparities of health for that group. So obviously, as we're working through this process, developing these curricula, we would have people with different sorts of disabilities at the table helping us to design the curriculum. partnering with key stakeholders. So it might be key organisations that are going to help with embedding the right content into the curriculum. And you'll see this is written for medical curriculum, but to review the curriculum that exists, to look at where there's opportunities and where there's potential for greater growth. Phase 5 involves creating the course materials. Amanda talked about patient stories. That's really important to embed stories at this level. But if you've got the people with disabilities in the curriculum development process, they can write the stories for you. They're real, they're tangible, and that's one of the benefits in having people with disabilities as part of the process. Then being able to deliver the course material and then evaluate it. So a very good process that goes around in cycles, that action research approach to build this content. And I would argue that it needs to be built throughout the curriculum. So obviously this comes down to how do we utilise our curriculum for lots of different purposes. And one of the challenges that I find is that when we have a research subject in a curriculum, people just think about research, but there are tools in those subjects that can be utilised in other places. And here is a really classic example where we need to encourage our students to think about how we use some of the skills that we learn in a research subject in other areas of healthcare. And so action research is a very good example here, that we can actually use action research to help us to co-design and co-produce the care to support people with disabilities, that enables us to evaluate what we're doing and to ensure that we're providing the best curriculum development and support as we work through that process. So in conclusion, I just want to say that the UN Sustainable Development Goals do seek to reduce inequity, promote good health and equality, that nurses and other health professionals have a really strong responsibility to assist with this, and that includes caring for people with disabilities and optimising their outcomes, that we can use co-design and co-production to underpin our curriculum and to strengthen them, and really that we need to continue to educate health professionals and give them the skills that they can utilise to be able to do that successfully. So thank you. And I hope that I didn't sound like I was half asleep, but I hope that was really helpful.
Terima kasih banyak Ibu Lisa. Jadi bahwa koproduksi dan kodesain ini memang dengan akhirnya menggunakan pendekatan participatory action research ya, yang disarankan untuk bisa nantinya mengetahui mana kebutuhan bagi teman-teman khususnya yang sedang menyusun dan karena kita ini sudah akan mendekati tahun ajaran baru begitu ya, supaya bisa mendesain kurikulum yang inklusif. Baik, kepada teman-teman yang ingin menanyakan ataupun memiliki pertanyaan kepada Prof. Lisa, dipersilahkan. Kita punya waktu 5-10 menit sebelum menuju ke sesi berikutnya. Silahkan kepada Bapak Ibu peserta, termasuk pembicara Pak Wanto juga boleh untuk bertanya Pak Wanto. Oke, kita ada pertanyaan dari Ibu Fitri. Riset ini merupakan salah satu metode untuk mengetahui seberapa besar tingkat kepedulian dan implementasi dari regulasi, khususnya tentang bagaimana kurikulum inklusif dan komponen kampus sudah menjalankan sesuai dengan harapan. Apakah di Lathrop University, di kampus Bulisa dan kampus lainnya di Australia, sudah banyak menerapkan riset tentang layanan pendidikan bagi disabilitas? Kemudian apakah riset itu sudah dijadikan pedoman dan apa dampaknya, atau adakah langkah lain yang bisa dilakukan?
That's a really good question. And I have to say, no, at the moment we have not done it, but we're very mindful and we're writing our curriculum at the moment with a thinking about how we do this. So I have researchers in the school who have definitely used co-design and co-production in providing their care with groups of people. We need to look at how we embed that, and we're looking at that now. We're looking at how we embed it through our curriculum and have use those transferable skills. One of the things that we're looking at in our new curriculum is students in the final semester actually doing a project of some sort, and it may well be that we're encouraging them to use those skills in that way. So it might, and I know in your curricula, you already have a project at the end. So that would be a really good place to actually think about how students could use those skills to design a model of care for people with disabilities. But it's something we're working on just like you are. But I think in a lot of ways, you're probably a bit ahead of us here, but we're learning from you. But no, the answer is not at the moment, but we're working on it.
Terima kasih Bu Lisa. Amanda tadi sempat sempat raise hand. Mungkin Amanda boleh bertanya ataupun merespon.
Yes, I just wanted to add to what Lisa was talking about, a couple of things. We did a small pilot piece of work around the inherent requirements and the students' experience of that when I was head of school at Australian Catholic University. And it was presented at a TEXA conference, which is one of the university regulatory body. And I think it was really important to understand that students really appreciated the inherent requirements, and we got feedback from them that helped to change some of the language. And so that's a very practical example of what Lisa was talking around in terms of co-design. The other thing to share is that I'm the editor of the textbook Chronic Illness and Disability, and throughout that text, we've worked with clinicians who are caring for people in the space of chronicity. And chronicity can also be a form of disability as well, depending on your interpretation. And so that particular textbook has very authentic case study and reflective questions that support teaching of those particular concepts to students as well.
Baik, terima kasih atas informasi tambahannya Bu Amanda dari riset dan juga program ataupun proyek yang sudah diterapkan. Ada pertanyaan lagi, ini kita cukup banyak pertanyaan, tetapi mungkin akan saya rangkum jadi satu atau dua nih ya. Jadi yang pertama adalah kendala saat menerapkan kurikulum disabilitas sesuai dengan pengalaman dari Lisa, dan di Fakultas Ilmu Kesehatan, khususnya Nursing, Midwifery, or other allied health professionals, adakah prasyarat tertentu bagi penyandang disabilitas? Karena misalnya kalau di program studi kesehatan juga ada beberapa prasyarat, tidak boleh buta warna, tinggi badan, dan sebagainya. Nah, itu bagaimana?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, and we haven't actually had, in the curriculum itself, we actually have not had very much disability at all. The agenda's improving, and as I said, we're looking very closely at how we embed that through our curriculum, and it's really important when we look at how many people have disabilities. And so from the perspective, we don't have any guidelines around what goes into the curriculum in that way, but we need to start to drive that ourselves. So as part of what we're doing now, that is something that we're doing. We're really mindful of that. As far as students with disabilities, the guidelines are really, and Amanda might be able to talk about this as well, but there are no real guidelines. Students have to be considered fit for practice. And one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is we've had there's not a lot of incentive for students with disabilities to come into nursing. There's a lot of barriers put up for them. And I think we need to start working on our board being a bit more open to the sorts of work that nurses can do. And I was really pleased, Amanda, you talked about the doctor, because there are lots of other roles that nurses can play. We don't have a conditional registration or anything like that. That might be there for a student that can get through the course. They might not practice clinically, but they can provide, as you say, research. They can work in policy, they can work in management, they can work in all sorts of other areas that are just as important for nursing. And I think that we still have barriers here in regard to who can come into nursing. So Amanda's got a hand up, I know, but it's something I feel very strongly about.
And equally, I have a lot of passion for that, because I think that at times the nursing profession and midwifery profession have actually acted as gatekeepers to keep out people who were disabled from entering into our professions. And I really feel that very passionate, which is why I started the work when I did in 2010 around the inherent requirements framework, and to be able to support students. And it really came about because of a student that had been in a severe motor vehicle accident with very, very significant physical limitations. And unfortunately, she wasn't able to finish her program, but we were able to support her to make a decision for a different career path that she found acceptable and that was evidence-based, rather than someone telling her you're no good to nursing. And I think we were able to preserve her self-esteem, her confidence came back, and she had hope. Whereas when she had the motor vehicle accident, she'd lost all hope, because everybody was saying to her, well, you can't be a nurse, you can't be a nurse. And ultimately that was the decision, but we were able to lead her to that decision in an empathetic way that I felt hadn't existed before that time. And so I do believe that the inherent requirement statements, if used correctly as a support enabling tool for all students, can really assist them to progress through their studies and to make some career choices as a graduate that are reflective of where their capability is at that point in time.
Terima kasih Ibu Lisa dan juga Ibu Amanda. Satu pertanyaan terakhir, jadi sejauh mana akomodasi yang layak, reasonable adjustment, itu bisa diberikan dan dilembagakan dalam kurikulum yang inklusif, mengingat ternyata ada beberapa pengalaman dari teman-teman penyandang disabilitas yang merasa dituduh, ya, merasa dituduh mereka diistimewakan oleh mereka yang mahasiswa non penyandang disabilitas. Jadi dirasa akomodasi yang layak di lingkungan perguruan tinggi terbatasi oleh kekhawatiran bahwa pemberian akomodasi yang bersifat tidak adil bagi mahasiswa non disabilitas. Mungkin dari Ibu Lisa?
That's a really hard one. But I think it's an individual, we have to go individually, case by case. Yeah. I had a student once who had a hearing disability. She had probably, I can't remember, but it was very minimal hearing ability, I think probably about 20%. And there was a lot of resistance to her being people would say she can't be a nurse, she can't be a nurse. But we had a modified stethoscope, so she could do everything with a modified stethoscope, and she was a very capable nurse. So possibly, I don't know where she ended up working, but she might not have chosen to work in an acute environment where she wouldn't have heard alarms and things that were going off, but she was able to get through the course and work in a context that would be suitable for her. I think it really is an individual thing, and I think we should be trying to work with all of students with disabilities in their own way. Amanda, I don't know what you think there, but I think it's very individual.
Yes, it should be managed on a case-by-case basis, because the legislation actually says that one disability does not transpose across to another. So if we use Lisa's example of a hearing impairment, how I perceive that and the level of impairment I may have and my response to that is different to another person who might have greater resilience, may have greater self-esteem, may have been using accommodation since they were a child, whereas I've just acquired my hearing impairment. So no two cases can be considered the same, and just because they have the same impairment or disability does not mean that they should be treated in the same way, because it's our interpretation of that at a personal level that's really important. The other thing I would say to you is that sometimes other people, other academics, other clinicians, registered nurses, perceive that because the student is given a plan with reasonable adjustments, accommodations embedded within it, that they are being advantaged. The reasonable adjustments, the accommodations, only work in a deficit to bring the person's ability to perform at the same level as any other year 2, year 3, year 1 student, because the academic integrity of the program of study should not be compromised. So you don't lower the standard. What you're doing is you're building the person's ability. So a powered stethoscope is an assistive technology which allows the person to have an accommodation. That means they then engage with the learning experiences, classroom and clinical, at the same capability as the remaining cohort of students. And so it's really important to understand that is one of the significant intents of inherent requirements and how you use them. And often a student doesn't want others to know that they've got reasonable adjustments, accommodations in place because of the stigmatization that occurs, particularly in placement, unfortunately, because people's prejudices come forward. And as I mentioned before, in our disciplines of nursing and midwifery, unfortunately, we see ourselves as being the gatekeeper of students who don't necessarily have the same sort of look, capability, whatever, as what we consider to be a registered nurse. But as we've said here today, both Lisa and myself, our communities have a diversity of people within them. Our workforce needs a diversity of people within it, because the two have to come together. And you can't care for somebody if you haven't been exposed to those levels of difference.
Terima kasih Amanda dan juga Lisa, sangat menarik sekali, dan ini mungkin bikin kaget ya, khususnya teman-teman pengajar kesehatan dan juga teman-teman nakes, bahwa seorang penyandang disabilitas rungu juga bisa menjadi seorang perawat ya, dengan adanya modifikasi tadi ya, alat yang difasilitasi oleh kampusnya. Dan memang akomodasi yang layak ini sifatnya individualistik, dan ya stigma memang ada di mana-mana, ditambah tadi dengan angka yang sudah disampaikan oleh Lisa bahwa angka penyandang disabilitas di Australia sangat tinggi sekarang, dan itu juga menggambarkan bahwa kita tidak akan bisa hidup bukan terlepas, tetapi justru kita tidak bisa melepaskan diri kita dengan tidak memberikan akomodasi gitu kepada teman-teman penyandang disabilitas, karena ini jadi hal yang tidak terelakkan untuk kita semua, bukan hanya tenaga kesehatan, tapi untuk semuanya. Luar biasa materi kita pada pagi hari ini. Kita masih punya satu pembicara, untuk Ibu Lisa dan Ibu Amanda, jika ingin stay juga tetap dipersilahkan, karena saya yakin juga mungkin waktu, dan juga Ibu Lisa juga di sana pukul 4 dini hari. Kita masih punya satu pembicara dari Bapak Wanto Noro, PhD. Beliau background-nya punya background sebagai seorang perawat, spesialis keperawatan medikal bedah. Saat ini beliau menjabat sebagai...
Thank you so much Lisa and Amanda.
Oke. Terima kasih banyak Lisa dan Amanda. Saat ini Bapak Wanto juga menjabat sebagai Wakil Dekan Bidang Kemahasiswaan dan juga Kerjasama di Fakultas Ilmu Kesehatan Universitas Aisyah Yogyakarta. Bapak Wanto nantinya juga mungkin akan menyampaikan hal-hal baru dan juga inspiratif untuk kita semua. Kepada Bapak Wanto, kami persilahkan.
Baik, terima kasih Ibu Cesa. Suara saya terdengar ya Bu Cesa ya?
Jelas, Bapak.
Oke, baik. Terima kasih. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi dan salam sejahtera untuk kita semua, Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati. Hello, Professor Amanda and Professor Lisa. Nice to meet you. I'm sorry to deliver my PPT with Bahasa Indonesia because our participant is almost Indonesian people. So, Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati, terima kasih kesempatannya untuk saya untuk bisa berbagi, sharing terkait dengan fostering inclusive approach to health equity in Indonesia. Dan hari ini saya akan memaparkan terkait dengan environmental press and adaptation to disability, karena kalau kita bicara lingkungan di Indonesia dengan demografi yang cukup luas, bahkan sangat luas, dengan berbagai infrastruktur yang juga berbeda-beda, dan ini menjadi tantangan tersendiri untuk saudara-saudara kita yang memiliki keterbatasan, gitu ya. Nah, perkenalkan dulu, nama saya Wantonoro. Saya berasal dari Universitas Aisyah Yogyakarta, dan saya adalah seorang perawat. Dan hari ini saya sedang memakai baju berwarna hitam bergaris putih, gitu ya. Oke. Oke, ada beberapa hal yang ingin coba saya sampaikan terkait dengan nursing education tentunya di Indonesia. Kemudian juga ada teori yang kemudian melandasi terkait dengan kebutuhan-kebutuhan yang diperlukan untuk saudara-saudara kita. Yang kedua terkait dengan beberapa riset saya yang barangkali nanti akan berhubungan dengan topik kita hari ini, yang kemudian akan saya rangkai dengan apa yang sedang saya kerjakan saat ini untuk riset-riset yang sedang saya lakukan bersama teman-teman di UNISA tentunya. Nah, kalau kita bicara tentang edukasi di Indonesia ataupun keseluruhannya, saya yakin Bapak Ibu yang berkecimpung di dunia pendidikan akan sangat paham tentang ini, dan Bapak Ibu juga yang praktisi dan teman-teman yang lain juga saya kira sudah memahami ini, bahwa level ataupun tipe pendidikan di Indonesia itu ada beberapa macam. Yang pertama adalah vocational education, atau yang biasa kita ada di level diploma. Kemudian juga ada academic education, ya, biasanya juga di sana ada bachelor atau sarjana, kemudian juga ada master degree. Kemudian juga ada profession education, yang ini biasanya ada spesialistik tersendiri yang kemudian kurikulumnya juga akan disesuaikan atau berbeda. Nah, kemudian kalau kita bicara, karena saya background-nya adalah seorang perawat, tentunya saya sudah melalui beberapa pendidikan di keperawatan, dan saya hanya ingin menjelaskan tentang keperawatan, karena untuk program yang lain saya kira nanti akan ada sedikit perbedaan, gitu ya. Nah, di nursing education kita ada diploma, kemudian sarjana, master, dan doktor. Nah, kemudian di diploma kita nanti akan ada ahli media, kemudian di bachelor kita nanti akan ada nurse yang generalis, yang ini ditempuh selama 5 tahun, yang 4 tahunnya itu ada di akademik, kemudian 1 tahunnya itu ada di clinical practice. Nah, kemudian kalau kita melihat di level master atau di magister, maka kemudian kita nanti akan ada pendidikan untuk di akademik ada 2 tahun, dan kemudian ada program spesialis. Nah, barangkali di program spesialis ini yang kemudian bisa kita create untuk kemudian ada spesialis terkait dengan beberapa kebutuhan khusus yang dibutuhkan untuk saudara-saudara kita. Saat ini saya sudah menempuh begitu ya di spesialis untuk ortopedik, yang nanti akan berkaitan dengan fungsi gerak dan seterusnya. Kemudian juga di spesialis ini ada spesialis komunitas, ada spesialis maternity, dan spesialis jiwa. Dan barangkali ke depan kita bisa create untuk spesialis yang memang memerlukan kebutuhan-kebutuhan khusus untuk saudara-saudara kita. Kemudian ada tahapan doktor, tentu ini juga terkait dengan konsep-konsep yang akan dibangun di nursing, di keperawatan. Oke, kemudian untuk menjadi seorang nurse di Indonesia, kita bicara dalam konteks Indonesia sesuai dengan regulasi yang ada di Indonesia, tentunya harus lulus dulu, kemudian juga nanti akan ada ujian eksam yang dilakukan oleh negara, yang kemudian itu akan simultan dilakukan untuk mendapatkan ijazah sebagai seorang perawat. Dan ini berlaku juga untuk profesi-profesi yang lain, saya kira. Kemudian setelah itu, setelah lulus, kemudian mendapatkan kelulusan di national exam, maka kemudian akan bisa mendapatkan sertifikat profesional sebagai seorang perawat. Dan ini juga sekali lagi akan berlaku bagi teman-teman juga yang memiliki profesi yang lain seperti kebidanan dan fisioterapi. Oke, kemudian kalau kita bicara terkait dengan nursing profesional, barangkali ini menjadi salah satu dasar kita untuk menyusun kurikulum di dalam pendidikan, terutama di kesehatan, bahwa seorang perawat yang profesional tentu harus memiliki pengetahuan atau kognitif yang baik terkait dengan berbagai macam kondisi yang ada di keperawatan. Dan di profesi lain juga tentu harus dilakukan. Kemudian juga ada clinical skill atau psikomotor yang kemudian harus dikuasai oleh seorang nurse. Sehingga memang kita harus ada praktis langsung dengan bertemu face to face dengan pasien. Kemudian juga ada attitude yang kemudian ini menjadi etika yang harus dibawa oleh seorang perawat. Nah, faktor-faktor ini tentu dipengaruhi begitu ya. Secara teori akan dipengaruhi oleh education, ada level pendidikannya, kemudian juga ada pengalaman, bisa dari training, bisa dari clinical practice. Kemudian juga kalau terkait dengan attitude, karena Indonesia ini memiliki budaya yang kemudian sangat banyak, dengan demografi juga yang begitu luas, maka kemudian satu budaya dengan budaya yang lain tentu akan ada perbedaan secara kebiasaan-kebiasaan atau adat. Yang ini juga nanti harus diketahui oleh tenaga kesehatan. Oke, juga di peraturan di Indonesia juga sudah menerapkan bahwa ada standar yang kemudian harus digunakan untuk perawat-perawat atau tenaga kesehatan yang ada di Indonesia. Nah, kemudian di standar itu tentu ada beberapa level ataupun hal-hal yang harus dilakukan di tatanan akademik, kemudian ada di tatanan praktik. Sehingga memang di pendidikan keperawatan harus ada pendidikan yang dilakukan secara akademik di kampus, kemudian juga harus ada pendidikan yang dilakukan di tatanan klinik. Nah, barangkali nanti juga ini akan menjadi salah satu bahan pertimbangan ketika kita menyusun sebuah kurikulum yang kemudian kurikulum itu diperuntukkan untuk saudara-saudara kita yang memang berkebutuhan khusus itu tadi. Kemudian kenapa kita harus memiliki clinical practice? Karena kita tahu bahwa ketika kita akan melakukan tindakan ke pasien, maka ada hal yang harus kita lakukan. Nah, hal yang harus kita lakukan itu tidak akan bisa kita lakukan hanya dengan membaca buku. Nah, itu harus dilakukan dengan praktis. Nah, sehingga praktis menjadi hal yang sangat dilakukan, harus dilakukan oleh seorang tenaga kesehatan. Nah, kemudian juga dalam proses keperawatan dan dalam proses asuhan kesehatan yang lain, saya kira hal-hal yang biasa dimulai di keperawatan itu terkait dengan pertama di asesmen dulu, ya kebutuhannya apa, kemudian dari kebutuhan itu kita memunculkan sebuah problem atau masalah, yang kemudian dari masalah itu nanti kita akan membuat sebuah planning atau rencana, dan rencana itu kita implementasikan, kita lakukan evaluasi, dan kita lakukan asesmen kembali apakah rencana itu berhasil atau tidak. Nah, untuk melakukan itu tentu ada standar-standar professional performance yang harus dikuasai, ya, terutama terkait dengan quality of care-nya, terkait dengan pengetahuan yang saat ini ada, karena pengetahuan itu setiap saat berkembang, gitu ya. Kemudian Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati, juga ada riset-riset yang kemudian harus mendukung terkait dengan hal tersebut. Nah, dalam konteks kurikulum tentu ini menjadi hal yang sangat harus ada dalam konteks seorang nurse, karena saya background-nya sekali lagi adalah seorang perawat. Oke, kemudian ini hanya salah satu contoh saja bahwa kemudian ketika saya membersamai pasien, gitu ya, yang kemudian pasien ini sebelumnya tidak mengalami apa-apa, tetapi ketika ada accident kemudian mengalami hal traumatik yang kemudian harus dan mengharuskan saudara kita ini untuk kemudian ada keterbatasan secara gerak, maka kemudian kita harus mendampingi dari awal di rumah sakit sampai kemudian pulang ke rumah. Nah, kondisi ini yang kemudian ketika harus pulang ke rumah, beradaptasi dengan lingkungan yang kemudian lingkungan itu tadi adalah lingkungan yang tidak bersahabat dalam tanda kutip dengan kondisinya yang baru tersebut, maka kemudian ini menjadi problem yang juga harus kita selesaikan. Oke. Kemudian juga ini juga salah satu contoh pasien yang saya rawat di tahun 2014-an yang kemudian harus sangat beradaptasi dengan lingkungan yang baru, yang lingkungan itu belum mensupport terkait dengan kondisinya yang kehilangan salah satu bagian tubuhnya. Nah, ini kan menjadi hal yang kemudian harus kita akomodir bersama, harus kita selesaikan secara bersama. Kemudian juga ada beberapa pasien-pasien, karena saya concern-nya di ortopedik, maka kemudian ada beberapa pasien atau saudara-saudara kita yang membutuhkan kebutuhan-kebutuhan yang sangat dibutuhkan terkait dengan kondisi yang dialami, gitu ya. Ketika harus dipasang open reduksi eksternal fiksasi, ini harus dipasang sekitar minimal 6 bulan, dan kondisi ini akan mempengaruhi keterbatasan-keterbatasan yang ada pada saudara-saudara kita. Oke, Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati, kemudian kalau kita bicara terkait dengan nursing, gitu ya, maka kemudian ada sebuah teori yaitu teori caring theory, yang kemudian teori ini menitik beratkan pada kebutuhan-kebutuhan humanity. Ya, sekali lagi bahwa kebutuhan humanity ini harus dilakukan oleh seorang tenaga kesehatan. Jadi saat ini teknologi sangat berkembang, sangat amat berkembang dengan berbagai macam robot sebagai salah satu support system untuk melakukan perawatan, tetapi kalau kita bicara caring, maka kemudian harus ada sentuhan dari seorang tenaga kesehatan ke pasien. Oke, kemudian ini hanya sebuah teori saja bahwa caring merupakan konsep inti dari sebuah asuhan kesehatan, terutama di keperawatan. Kemudian juga caring merupakan salah satu hal yang kemudian bisa menyebabkan pasien itu berada pada posisi yang well-being, gitu ya, sangat baik kondisi kehidupannya. Oke, dari beberapa tadi yang saya sampaikan, dasar-dasarnya adalah ada konsep analisis, kemudian ada teori yang mendukung, kemudian juga regulasi dari pemerintah terkait dengan kebijakan standar-standar kurikulum, kemudian juga ada regulasi yang kemudian dikeluarkan oleh organisasi profesi, maka kemudian edukasi di dalam sebuah institusi pendidikan di akademik, dan kemudian dilanjutkan di dalam proses clinical practice menjadi hal yang penting untuk dilakukan. Dan juga di slide selanjutnya ada teori terkait dengan environmental press, gitu ya. Jadi teori ini menggambarkan bahwa ketika kompetensi atau kapasitas fungsi dari fungsi tubuh seseorang itu menurun, maka kemudian ada tekanan lingkungan yang kemudian harus disesuaikan. Dalam artian ketika ada hal yang harus disesuaikan terkait dengan kebutuhan dari saudara-saudara kita, tentu infrastruktur kemudian juga alat-alat yang harus digunakan juga harus menyesuaikan. Ya, jadi kalau teori ini menyampaikan bahwa seorang individu akan berfungsi, akan baik dalam konteks kehidupan sehari-hari, fungsi tubuhnya terkait dengan ada penurunan fungsi yang kemudian diimbangi dengan peningkatan infrastruktur yang kemudian menjadi hal yang penting. Infrastruktur termasuk di dalamnya adalah social environment, gitu ya. Kemudian ada orang-orang di sekitarnya yang peduli, yang care dengan kondisi itu. Kemudian juga di dalam konteks keperawatan, karena beberapa rekan-rekan yang saya dampingi yang memiliki keterbatasan fungsi gerak, gitu ya, karena adanya fraktur, kemudian karena amputasi, karena juga ada spinal cord injury sehingga terjadi kelemahan pada ekstremitas, kemudian juga karena stroke, begitu ya, yang ini membutuhkan sebuah asesmen, ya, yang asesmennya itu harus di-asesmen dengan baik, yang kemudian dari asesmen itu kita bisa menentukan kebutuhan apa yang dibutuhkan oleh saudara-saudara kita itu. Nah, salah satu instrumen yang bisa dilakukan adalah dengan Lawton Instrument Activity of Daily Living. Oke, kemudian juga kita sudah familiar, saya kira, dengan Bartel Index. Nah, salah satu instrumen yang bisa digunakan untuk mengakses, untuk kemudian kita bisa gunakan untuk mendeteksi kebutuhan dari saudara-saudara kita yang kemudian akan memiliki hal-hal yang harus disesuaikan dengan kebutuhannya. Oke, kemudian juga ada beberapa riset yang kemudian kami lakukan bersama teman-teman di Universitas Aisyah Yogyakarta. Tadi ada kondisi yang kemudian harus dibutuhkan secara khusus untuk saudara-saudara kita yang mengalami stroke, maka kemudian harus ada sebuah SOP begitu ya, terkait dengan exercise, terkait dengan hal-hal yang harus direncanakan untuk saudara-saudara kita tadi yang membutuhkan untuk bisa beradaptasi dengan kondisinya. Nah, barangkali juga ini menjadi dasar yang kemudian harus kita sampaikan kepada rekan-rekan mahasiswa di tahapan akademik dan tahapan profesi, yang kemudian mereka akan lebih paham dan tahu terkait dengan apa yang dibutuhkan oleh saudara-saudara kita. Oke, kemudian juga kemudian juga ada riset kami yang kemudian juga menelaah terkait dengan kualitas hidup, karena kita kalau bicara terkait dengan salah satu luaran atau hal yang dibutuhkan adalah quality of life. Nah, ada beberapa telaah kami yang juga menyampaikan bahwa ketika ada salah satu bagian tubuh yang kemudian memerlukan kebutuhan yang secara spesifik terkait dengan adanya patah tulang atau fraktur, maka kemudian ada timing-timing tertentu yang kemudian harus kita perhatikan secara bersama, ya, sehingga ketika timing itu dilakukan dengan sangat tepat, sangat baik, maka kemudian kualitas hidupnya akan bisa dipertahankan atau bisa ditingkatkan. Nah, hal ini membutuhkan interdisciplinary care, gitu ya. Jadi tidak hanya satu profesi saja, tetapi akan beberapa profesi yang harus kemudian include-kan dalam situ. Nah, terkait dengan hal ini, maka di kurikulum di kami itu sudah melakukan kegiatan-kegiatan IPE, yaitu Interprofessional Education, yang kemudian di dalamnya masuk semua komponen profesi kesehatan yang mendiskusikan dan menyelesaikan masalah kesehatan pada saudara-saudara kita yang membutuhkan tersebut. Oke, kemudian juga terkait dengan riset yang lain, ya, karena saya sekali lagi fokusnya ada di ortopedik, ya, yang terkait dengan keterbatasan fungsi gerak, maka kemudian juga ada berbagai macam hal yang kemudian harus kita perhatikan, termasuk ketika ada physical function yang kemudian menurun, maka kemudian ada faktor-faktor yang lain yang kemudian harus kita manage dengan baik, sehingga akan menyebabkan peningkatan atau pertahanan kualitas hidupnya akan lebih bagus, gitu ya, sehingga tadi interdisiplin menjadi hal yang penting karena bisa secara komprehensif untuk membersamai saudara-saudara kita terkait dengan kebutuhan apa yang dibutuhkan. Oke, kemudian juga satu lagi untuk riset yang sudah kami lakukan terkait dengan functional status pada pasien dengan HIP di Indonesia, maka kemudian salah satu hal yang kami temukan adalah tadi terkait dengan saudara kita tadi yang sudah menjalani operasi, kemudian pulang ke rumahnya, gitu ya, yang kemudian rumah itu tidak terkondisikan dengan baik dengan kebutuhan yang dibutuhkan, sehingga harus ada modifikasi yang dilakukan, dan modifikasi itu harus ada edukasi. Bagaimana kemudian modifikasi itu bisa mengakomodir apa yang dibutuhkan oleh tadi yang memiliki kebutuhan yang dibutuhkan. Kemudian dari situ ada hospital discharge yang kemudian kita setting dari awal sampai dengan pasien itu pulang ke rumah. Ya, jadi long term care menjadi hal yang sangat dibutuhkan ketika pasien atau saudara kita itu ada di tatanan rumah sakit, kemudian harus pulang dengan kondisi yang harus menyesuaikan dengan lingkungannya yang ada di rumah sakit. Nah, kegiatan yang kami lakukan adalah dengan tadi, karena interdisiplin menjadi hal yang sangat penting, kemudian juga komprehensif juga menjadi hal yang sangat penting. Beberapa hal yang kami lakukan, yang pertama adalah dengan melakukan kunjungan ke rumah saudara-saudara kita tadi yang membutuhkan, untuk bersama-sama bagaimana memodifikasi lingkungan rumah sehingga bisa mengakomodir kebutuhan dari saudara-saudara kita. Nah, hal yang kami lakukan saat ini adalah dengan program Long Interdisciplinary Community Care Universitas Aisyah Yogyakarta, atau yang disingkat dengan POLIS UNISA. Yang ini kegiatannya adalah kegiatan yang dilakukan dengan face to face dengan pasien dan keluarga dari rumah sakit, kemudian kembali ke rumah dengan memodifikasi, dengan meningkatkan pengetahuan, dan dengan memberikan hal-hal apa yang dibutuhkan dengan berbagai macam disiplin ilmu yang tergabung di dalamnya. Oke, kemudian juga hal yang kami lakukan juga untuk mendukung tadi modifikasi lingkungan. Hal yang kami temukan pada pasien kami yang memiliki keterbatasan gerak adalah dengan adanya kebutuhan untuk eliminasi yang sangat sulit dilakukan oleh saudara-saudara kita yang post operasi. Nah, itu kemudian membutuhkan sebuah alat yang bisa terjangkau, yang kemudian bisa digunakan di rumah masing-masing, sehingga kami saat ini sedang bekerja bersama-sama untuk membuat sebuah kursi yang bisa dimanfaatkan untuk kebutuhan eliminasi pada pasien dengan tadi post operasi fraktur. Dan barangkali nanti kita bisa sama-sama mendiskusikan, bisa join riset atau barangkali terkait dengan beberapa hal yang sudah saya sampaikan tadi, bahwa kemudian kalau saya itu mengawali kegiatan-kegiatan untuk memenuhi kebutuhan saudara-saudara kita yang memiliki kebutuhan tadi itu dengan berbagai macam hal kajian riset yang kemudian kita lakukan, yang kemudian kita coba untuk ejawantahkan atau kita bumikan dengan melakukan turun langsung atau dengan face to face langsung ke pasien yang membutuhkan, dan ini melibatkan mahasiswa yang kemudian mahasiswa ini dari berbagai macam profesi yang kemudian nanti akan bersama-sama untuk menyelesaikan problem yang ada. Karena kita tahu bahwa kalau kita lihat secara infrastruktur di tiap daerah akan berbeda dan kebutuhannya juga berbeda, dan kemudian juga faktor-faktor yang kemudian mendukung dan tidak mendukung juga akan juga bervariasi antar antar individu, sehingga konsep pasien center care menjadi hal yang menarik untuk kemudian dipraktikkan kepada atau diberikan kepada saudara-saudara kita yang membutuhkan. Gitu. Jadi Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati, bahwa ketika kita bicara kurikulum, memang ini menjadi tantangan kita bersama untuk bisa melibatkan teman-teman yang tadi untuk bisa bersamai saudara-saudara kita yang membutuhkan tadi. Nah, barangkali itu yang bisa saya sampaikan, Ibu Cesa dan rekan-rekan semua. Saya yakin di sini banyak expert, ada Bu Islam yang ini expert di disability, kemudian juga ada Ibu Dina yang kemudian juga sangat concern di disability. Gitu ya. Baik, terima kasih Bu Cesa. Kurang lebihnya saya mohon maaf, dan barangkali ini hanya untuk awal diskusi kita, karena saya yakin di sini banyak expert ya, ada Bu Ismawati yang concern di di kurikulum. Ya, terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Pak Wanto. Jadi paparannya memang sejalan dengan selama ini yang sudah didiskusikan dan juga diseminarkan ya, bahwa yang namanya konsep disabilitas itu adalah konsep yang evolve, berubah, bahwa pada akhirnya setiap individu itu bisa mengalami disabilitas gitu. Bahkan menjadi tua pun juga nanti akan menyebabkan kita mengalami disabilitas fisik. Baik, ada beberapa pertanyaan yang sudah masuk ini Pak Wanto. Kita lanjut ke sesi tanya jawab. Jadi pertanyaan pertama ini ada dari Bu Fitri Nugrahaningrum. Untuk menjadi seorang terapis, para penyandang disabilitas netra wajib menyelesaikan sekolah terapis dan memiliki sertifikat sebagai seorang terapis. Menurut Bapak, apakah memungkinkan penyandang disabilitas netra untuk masuk ke sekolah kesehatan dan melanjutkan misalnya ke spesialis ortopedi atau fisioterapi, dan apakah memungkinkan keahlian pijat bagi penyandang disabilitas netra diadopt gitu ya, jadi salah satu model pengobatan yang diayomi oleh Dinas Kesehatan. Silakan mungkin dari Pak Wanto untuk merespon.
Baik, terima kasih pertanyaannya ya terkait dengan apa tadi yang disampaikan. Terima kasih Bu Fitri Nugrahaningrum ya, salam kenal Ibu. Jadi ini dari perspektif saya Bu ya. Jadi ketika kita bicara dalam konteks pemenuhan kebutuhan kesehatan, karena background saya adalah di perawatan sekali lagi, jadi hal yang kami lakukan adalah pemenuhan kebutuhan dasar, gitu ya, kebutuhan dasar, termasuk tadi kenyamanan. Kemudian apakah tadi pijat itu bisa menjadi diadopsi, gitu ya? Itu sangat bisa, Bu. Jadi beberapa hal yang kami lakukan, gitu ya, ketika pasien itu akan menjalani operasi, salah satu hal yang paling dikeluhkan adalah konstipasi. Nah, konstipasi itu ada beberapa cara untuk bisa menyelesaikan, termasuk evidence base yang kami temukan adalah dengan menggunakan pijat pada bagian perutnya. Nah, itu kan bisa diadopsi untuk kemudian rekan-rekan bisa melakukan itu. Nah, tetapi kemudian kalau pertanyaan terkait dengan memungkinkan penyandang disabilitas netra untuk masuk ke sekolah kesehatan. Nah, ini tentu kalau di Indonesia belum menjadi hal yang umum untuk dilakukan karena memang ada syarat-syarat tertentu untuk kemudian bisa menjadi seorang tenaga kesehatan tadi. Tetapi ke depan barangkali dengan kegiatan-kegiatan seperti ini ke depan kalau memungkinkan gitu ya, kalau dibilang mungkin, nah ini tergantung nanti regulasi dengan berbagai macam organisasi yang ada di profesi. Saya kira tanggapan saya seperti itu, mudah-mudahan bisa untuk menjawab. Gitu ya. Oke. Barangkali ada tambahan dari expert-expert yang lain, begitu Bu Jasa.
Baik, terima kasih banyak Pak Wanto. Untuk pertanyaan berikutnya, ini kita juga sudah, jadi sangat cukup jelas ya tadi ya, bahwa memang kita teman-teman penyandang disabilitas netra yang tadi sudah mungkin memiliki sertifikat sebagai seorang terapis, ini juga tetap bisa berkontribusi terhadap pemenuhan kebutuhan kesehatan khususnya di setting klinis gitu. Ada pertanyaan berikutnya, ini dari Pak David ini, Pak David. Terima kasih atas presentasi dari 3 pembicara yang luar biasa. Pak David ini seorang dosen dan ada beberapa pertanyaan yang mungkin salah satunya sangat sederhana. Jadi yang pertama, Pak David memiliki keterbatasan dalam melihat warna atau buta warna parsial. Apakah saya termasuk seorang dengan disabilitas? Saya bingung saat mengisi kuesioner untuk agenda ini, karena memang pada saat masuk ke Zoom kan ada pertanyaan tentang hal tersebut. Kemudian yang berikutnya, saya dulu merupakan seorang lulusan dari SMA dengan jurusan IPA dan sangat ingin sekali menjadi seorang perawat, melamar di berbagai institusi keperawatan, tapi tidak bisa karena saya memiliki buta warna parsial. Untuk saat ini, apakah ada regulasi pendidikan terhadap seseorang dengan keterbatasan untuk menjadi perawat di Indonesia? Kemudian yang ketiga, menurut pembicara, dalam hal ini menurut Pak Wanto, karena saya seorang pendidik, kurikulum pendidikan seperti apa yang mampu menyediakan ekuitas pendidikan yang baik untuk mengurangi disparitas pendidikan, khususnya bagi teman-teman penyandang disabilitas. 3 pertanyaan itu mungkin Pak Wanto.
Baik, terima kasih, pertanyaannya sangat luar biasa dan saya kira ini Bu Dina sangat kompeten untuk menjawab yang pertama ini ya. Oke, jadi kalau menurut persepsi saya bahwa kemudian disabilitas terkait dengan buta warna yang parsial, saya kira ini menjadi salah satu bagian dari disabilitas karena memang ada keterbatasan yang kemudian harus kita akomodir bersama. Itu yang pertama. Kemudian yang kedua terkait dengan institusi keperawatan tidak memiliki buta warna parsial gitu ya. Jadi begini Pak David dan rekan-rekan semua, mohon saya dikoreksi kalau keliru ya. Jadi ketika kita sudah bertugas menjadi seorang tenaga kesehatan, ada beberapa hal yang harus kita amati secara cermat. Misalnya kita ada di bagian unit gawat darurat. Di sana nanti akan ada triase. Triase itu menggunakan berbagai macam warna yang kemudian harus dipahami. Kemudian juga ketika kita ingin memberikan terapi obat ataupun beberapa terapi yang lain, maka kemudian ada berbagai macam obat yang kemudian ada juga yang ada kode-kode warna yang kemudian harus ditaati dan dipatuhi. Nah, sehingga hal itu yang kemudian menjadi penting untuk saudara-saudara kami di tenaga kesehatan yang kemudian harus memiliki kemampuan untuk membedakan warna tersebut. Sehingga nanti ketika kemampuan itu dimiliki tidak akan salah untuk melakukan berbagai macam tindakan. Ya, misalnya tadi juga ada cairan yang kemudian juga warnanya akan berbeda gitu ya, akan berbeda seperti albumin dan NaCl dan seterusnya, itu warnanya akan berbeda, yang kemudian itu harus dipahami oleh seorang tenaga kesehatan ketika ingin memberikan. Nah, kalau itu tidak dipahami maka kemudian akan menjadi bahaya untuk yang diberikan, gitu ya. Sehingga kalau kita bicara patient safety ini menjadi hal yang crucial, menjadi hal yang sangat penting, gitu ya. Kemudian yang ketiga, ya kalau terkait dengan ekuitas, saya kira nanti akan bisa dilakukan sepanjang tadi ya infrastruktur mendukung, gitu ya. Jadi pengalaman saya kuliah di salah satu universitas di Taiwan, di sana sudah sangat mengakomodir terkait dengan berbagai macam kebutuhan, ya terkait dengan berbagai infrastruktur yang dibutuhkan untuk saudara-saudara kita, untuk teman-teman yang tadi memiliki kebutuhan-kebutuhan yang harus dipenuhi, begitu ya. Sehingga apakah di pendidikan, di kurikulum, kalau secara kurikulum saya kira nanti bisa diakomodir, kemudian juga kalau secara infrastruktur nanti bisa diupayakan, tetapi kemudian ada syarat dan ketentuan yang berlaku di setiap profesi, yang kemudian itu tujuannya adalah untuk keamanan dari pelayanan yang dilakukan. Sehingga barangkali di masing-masing profesi akan berbeda regulasinya. Jadi barangkali itu Pak David dan rekan-rekan semua, mohon dikoreksi kalau ada yang kurang tepat.
Baik, terima kasih Pak Wanto. Jadi sedikit menyampaikan ya, ini karena Bu Dina dalam perjalanan ke kampus dan nanti saat sesi workshop, saat sesi diskusi akan bergabung kembali. Jadi info Bu Dina, kalau di Australia beliau bisa menjawab bahwa buta warna parsial itu merupakan bentuk disabilitas. Tetapi beliau juga paham karena ada beberapa individu, ada juga individu yang tidak mau menyebutkan keterbatasan yang ada pada dirinya sebagai bentuk disabilitas. Karena sebenarnya kan itu keterbatasan karena tidak bisa melihat spektrum warna tertentu begitu ya. Nah, sebagai seorang peneliti, Budina melihat ini sebagai manifestasi berbagai latar belakang. Tadi juga sebenarnya ada contoh dari Lisa dan Amanda. Ada mahasiswa yang tidak mau orang lain tahu kalau mereka mendapatkan akomodasi tertentu karena khawatir dianggap oleh lingkungan mendapat perlakuan yang khusus. Jadi seperti pertanyaan dari Mas Philip tadi. Itu. Kemudian mungkin sedikit menyimpulkan juga bahwa bentuk akomodasi yang layak ini sepertinya perlu juga kita tekankan ya, khususnya seperti karena sekarang juga sudah ada beberapa teknologi untuk membantu teman-teman yang buta warna untuk bisa melihat dengan lebih jelas gitu ya. Ada kacamata khusus buta warna, karena kalau yang tadi stetoskopnya yang dimodifikasi untuk bisa mengoptimalkan kemampuan pendengaran dari mahasiswa dengan disabilitas rungu ini bukan tidak mungkin nantinya ya Pak Wanto ya akan ada perubahan regulasi regulasi ataupun dari kampus sendiri gitu ya juga bisa memberikan akomodasi tersebut gitu ya. Baik, adakah yang ingin didiskusikan kembali ataupun dikonfirmasi kepada pembicara? Baik, sudah cukup. Terima kasih banyak Pak Wanto atas penyampaiannya yang luar biasa tadi ya. Jadi kalau teman-teman tadi melihat mungkin ada gambar terkait dengan disabilitas fisik begitu ya, luka terbuka gitu. Bisa jadi ada perasaan tidak menyenangkan, tetapi ya memang itu kondisi yang real yang memang seringkali dihadapi oleh teman-teman nakes. Terima kasih banyak kepada rekan-rekan yang sudah bergabung. Saya kembalikan kepada Pak Rival.
Oke, Mbak Cesa. Terima kasih banyak. Kasih aplaus untuk Mbak Cesa.